So let's start off by seeing what we can remember about the word and symbol equations for photosynthesis and respiration. You do need to learn these off by heart, and the good thing about it is if you can learn one of them, you'll know the other one really well as well. Okay, so in each reaction, what you need to think about as well is where the energy is being transferred. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to jot those down. We want the equation for photosynthesis, the equation for aerobic respiration, and the equations for anaerobic respiration, if you know that too. Let's start with photosynthesis then. So for photosynthesis, check what you've got written down. Hopefully you have carbon dioxide plus water making glucose plus oxygen. And the simple equations for those: carbon dioxide is CO2, water is H2O, oxygen is O2. I'm sure that you know all of those. So we just need to learn that glucose is C6H12O6. And then in order to balance that equation, you can see it is 666. Not a good number. We could call it the evil equation. Just try and remember those. The glucose has already got 6 carbons in it, so we don't need to add anything to that. We just need to add 6 of each of the other parts of that equation. I also asked you to think about the energy and where that might be transferred. So it is an absorption of energy. We need to transfer energy to the chlorophyll from light. Okay, so for photosynthesis to occur, light energy needs to be transferred to the chlorophyll in the chloroplasts. I have used the word transferred because that's what we want to do. We don't want to talk about energy being used or made or gone in any way. We always want to try and use that word transferred to make sure that we pick up those marks. Respiration then. We'll start off with aerobic respiration. What do we get for this? Check your answer. Hopefully you've got exactly the reverse of that photosynthesis equation. So glucose plus oxygen will form carbon dioxide and water, and that symbol equation is exactly the same. So there's your C6H12O6 and then we've got 6 oxygens going to make 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. In terms of the energy being transferred, it's being transferred from the glucose. So energy is transferred from the glucose, and we can then use it in our cells for all the different things that it's needed for there. We are not going to say made, we are not going to say created, because if we do, we will lose those easy marks. Anaerobic respiration then. So there's a couple of different ones that we need to know. We'll start with animal cells. So animals, including humans, because don't forget we're animals. When we carry out anaerobic respiration, it's respiration in the absence of oxygen, the glucose is converted into lactic acid. You'll have heard about that before, that build-up of lactic acid that makes your muscles hurt when you do too much exercise, when you've not trained for it. In plant or yeast cells, that's going to be slightly different. So it's still going to be just the glucose without oxygen, but it's going to make ethanol and carbon dioxide. So it still makes carbon dioxide, but instead of water, we're making ethanol. What's happening with the energy transfer here? It's still being transferred from the glucose, but in much smaller amounts than it is in aerobic respiration. So we are still getting a little bit of energy, but not as much energy as we would have if oxygen had been present and aerobic respiration had been carried out. Okay, let's have a go and see if you'd already got that right straight away. Brilliant. Let's now see if we could apply that in an exam question. So even if you didn't get it right in the starter, you can have a go at these questions here. So all we need to do is work out what would go in those missing spots. You can jot them down onto the bit of paper that you've got, and I will go through the answers in a couple of minutes. I will give you a little bit of time to do this. If you find you still need a little bit more time, you can pause the recording before I go on to the answers. Okay, I'm going to move on now, but if you still need a little bit of extra time to get your answers down, just pause the video and then you can set it going again, ready for the answers once you've got them all down. Okay, first one then. We need to fill in the missing gaps in the equation. It is photosynthesis, so it's carbon dioxide plus water. We've got some light energy referred to in the equation there, and then we've got the arrow showing that we're going to make glucose and oxygen. So 2 marks there, hopefully you got both of those. What is the name of the green substance that absorbs the light energy? That is chlorophyll. So remember the chlorophyll, which is inside the chloroplasts in the plant cells. Another question, this time it is the symbol equations that we needed. So 6CO2, and it's the balanced symbol equation, so we needed 6 H2O. This time they've got the light energy across the arrow showing that light is needed, and then we're going to make C6H12O6 and 6 oxygens. Another 2 marks there. See how easy these marks are if you just learnt these equations. Again, this another example here, they want you to balance the equation. So the full equation was there, but you needed to balance it. So remember what we said? 6, 6, 6. We've balanced that equation. Easy 1 mark there. And then what is the name of that substance? C6H12O6. It is glucose. So add up how many you've got. There was a possible 7 marks up for grabs there. Hopefully you managed to get 7 out of 7. Let's try some more. Here's some that are about respiration then. So again, I'll give you a minute or two to have a go at those. I'll warn you before I move on, you can pause it if you haven't quite finished. So just jot your answers down on your paper and pen, and we'll see how you did when I move on to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to move on now, so just pause if you need a little bit more time. Okay, so what is produced during anaerobic respiration in humans? Remember, humans are animals, so it was lactic acid that we were looking for. Then complete the equation for anaerobic respiration in yeast. Yeast are not animal cells, therefore they're going to be producing carbon dioxide plus ethanol. And then again, see how easy marks we can pick up if we can learn these formulas. Formula of glucose, C6H12O6. The next thing we need to think about then is what are plants going to do with that glucose that they've created. So they have carried out this photosynthesis, they have created lots of glucose. How is that then going to be used in the plant? So they were going to carry out respiration themselves. So the first thing that we can think about is that plants would use glucose in respiration. They can also store it for later. So think about some of the plants that we eat. Potatoes, for example, are full of starch. That's how the plant is storing the glucose for when it might need it later, and we sneak in there and steal it for ourselves. They also can make it into cellulose. So both starch and cellulose are lots of glucose joined together. starch as a storage, cellulose makes up the cell wall. So really, really important that plants are able to produce cellulose. And they can also turn it into oils and waxes. So that's useful for waterproofing plants. Think about like the waxy cuticle on the top of the leaf. And again, it can be a storage. Things like nuts and seeds often have lots of fats within them, so that the plant can use it as a store for its offspring as they grow and develop before they can start photosynthesizing for themselves. Also, if they get nitrogen ions, which they will take up from the soil, they can convert glucose into amino acids. And then they can use amino acids, they can add them up together so that they can make protein. What else do we need to know about photosynthesis then? We need to know what is going to help photosynthesis happen quickly and what is going to slow it down. So there are 4 limiting factors that we need to be aware of. They are the amount of chlorophyll that the plant has. So unless light energy can be absorbed by the chlorophyll, photosynthesis can't take place. The light intensity. So how much light is available can affect how quickly a plant can photosynthesize. Carbon dioxide concentration. Carbon dioxide is one of the main things that we need, along with water, to carry out photosynthesis. So if we haven't got enough carbon dioxide, it won't be able to take place. And then, just like with any reaction, temperature is important. So we know that higher temperatures can speed up reactions, and reactions in living things that are controlled by enzymes can be affected negatively if temperatures are too high as well. Let's have a look at how that might come up in an exam question then. So this first one is thinking about this variegated leaf. So it's variegated, it's got some part of it that's green, some part of it that was yellow. And what they did, they tested it to see which parts of the plant leaf had sugar that had been produced. And they found that the green area did, but the yellow area didn't. So what you needed to do was explain as fully as you can why the yellow region of this leaf had not produced sugar. So we're looking for 2 marks. It's a 2-mark question. So 2 parts to this explanation. I'll give you a little bit of time to have a go at this, and again I'll warn you before it's time to move on in case you want to pause if you need a little bit extra time. That's your warning to pause then, before I move on, if you haven't quite got your answer down on your bit of paper. So what is it about that yellow region that means that it's not produced sugar? If it's yellow and not green, that means it doesn't contain chlorophyll. So there was 1 mark for saying that there was no chlorophyll. And then the 2nd mark was for saying that the chlorophyll is needed to absorb the light or to absorb the energy from the light so that photosynthesis could take place. for the other three limiting factors, we need to be able to describe and explain what graphs would look like. So what I'd like to do on your bit of paper for me, you need to do 3 graphs. So for each of them, the rate of photosynthesis goes on the y-axis. So we're looking at how the rate of photosynthesis might increase or decrease. And then you will need 1 graph for light intensity, 1 graph for carbon dioxide concentration, and 1 graph for temperature. So as light intensity increases, what would happen to the rate of photosynthesis? As carbon dioxide increases, what would happen to the rate of photosynthesis? And as temperature increases, what would happen to the rate of photosynthesis? Just give you a minute to sketch those. Again, if you need to, you can just pause this video if you need a little bit extra time. Pause me if you're not quite ready, otherwise I'm going to move on now. So there is the light intensity graph. You can see we've got an increase followed by it levelling off. Carbon dioxide is exactly the same. We've got an increase at first and then we've got a levelling off. And your temperature graph slightly different. It increases, it peaks, and then it decreases again. So let's have a look at why each of those graphs is that shape. Let's start with the light intensity graph then. So if we were going to describe this, what we're seeing as the light intensity increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases. Why is that happening? Well, it is to do with the energy. So we need light energy for photosynthesis reaction to take place. It is an endothermic reaction. It needs to take in energy to make it happen. So the more light there is, the more energy. And that means that the rate of photosynthesis increases. But it then levels off because at that point it's been limited by other things. You've got plenty of energy from the light, but maybe not enough carbon dioxide. Or it's too cold for the reaction to take place any more quickly. So we say it levels off because it's been limited by other limiting factors, such as carbon dioxide or temperature. Can you now apply those same ideas to the carbon dioxide concentration graph? So it is exactly the same shape. Can we think about the explanation for the carbon dioxide one now that we know the explanation for the light graph? At the beginning, we see that same pattern. As the carbon dioxide concentration increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases. Why is that? It's because carbon dioxide is one of the reactants required. So if you don't have carbon dioxide, you can't carry out the reaction. People often ask why water isn't a limiting factor when it is one of the other reactants, or it is the other reactant of photosynthesis. But remember that plant cells are full of cytoplasm, which contains water. If the plant didn't have enough water, photosynthesis would be the least of its problems. It definitely wouldn't be alive. But it can live for short periods of time with not enough carbon dioxide. So, as the carbon dioxide levels increase, the rate of photosynthesis increases because carbon dioxide is needed for the reaction to take place. Again, it levels off, and it levels off because it's being limited by other limiting factors. And you need to give the examples of those limiting factors. So again, it's temperature and this time it's light. So you might have loads of carbon dioxide, but if it's the middle of the night and it's pitch black, the plant won't be able to photosynthesize because it won't have the energy. Finally, the temperature graph then. So this time you need to think about your enzyme knowledge. So Unit 2, we talk all about enzymes. You need to remember enzymes are involved in photosynthesis. So we do, at the beginning, have that same idea that we have with any chemical reaction. As temperature increases, the rate of photosynthesis increases. And why is that? Because there'll be more successful collisions. So everything has more energy because of the higher temperature, so there are more successful collisions. But above the optimum temperature, an enzyme-controlled reaction will slow down and then eventually stop when the enzymes are denatured. So remember, if enzymes are exposed to temperatures that are too high, then they will lose their shape. The substrate and the enzyme will no longer fit together, and that will mean that the reaction can no longer take place. Let's have a look at some questions about this then. So you have got a graph to look at. It's about a farmer who's growing tomato plants in a greenhouse, and they've looked at the rate of photosynthesis at different light intensities. So 3 questions to have a look at. Give you a couple of minutes to have a look at those. Jot your answers down on your bit of paper, and I will go through those answers with you in a second. Okay, I'm ready to move on. If you're not, then just pause the video and you can restart it and look at the answers when you're ready. Okay, easy marks then, as it says. First thing is just reading the information from the graph. So at what light intensity was light a limiting factor for photosynthesis? We know if it was a limiting factor, if it was stopping photosynthesis being at its maximum. So anywhere between 0 and just before 4 arbitrary units, we could see that the more light there was, the more photosynthesis there was. So light must have been a limiting factor. Above that value, the level of photosynthesis stays the same, so that's where it must have been limited by other factors. So the correct answer for part 1 was 1 arbitrary unit. The highest rate of photosynthesis, again we were just reading this off the graph, so we're looking at what level the straight line was. So reading across that on the graph, it was 210 arbitrary units where the rate of photosynthesis was at its maximum. And then the farmer wanted to increase the rate of photosynthesis. Other than light intensity, what could he change? So other than light intensity, what are our other limiting factors? Temperature or carbon dioxide. If you've got either of those, then you would get that mark. We couldn't have chlorophyll here because the farmer wouldn't be able to change the amount of chlorophyll his plants have. That isn't something that he can do. He could choose to plant plants with more chlorophyll, but he couldn't give more chlorophyll to the plants that he already has. How can we prove that these limiting factors are actually having an effect on plants? We can look at experimentally changing the light or the temperature or the carbon dioxide by carrying out this practical here. So it's very difficult to be able to measure how fast photosynthesis is happening when it's happening in the cells of a plant. It isn't like a chemistry practical where we can see it happening so easily. But if we carry it out in a water plant, then we are able to measure how quickly it's happening. So if you can see in this diagram of the required practical here, we've got a tiny little bubble at the top of that test tube. That is a bubble of oxygen that's being produced by this water plant as it photosynthesizes. So as water plants photosynthesize and produce oxygen, that oxygen will be released from the plant, and you can see bubbles in the water as that happens. So we can change the distance that we have our light away. As you can see on the diagram here, we can move the light different distances along a ruler, and we can then measure how quickly bubbles are produced. So we can count how many bubbles are produced in a minute. If we wanted to, we could also change the temperature of the water that we kept that plant in and keep the light at the same distance, and then see whether that had an effect. And we can give the plant carbon dioxide in the form of sodium hydrogen carbonate. So from that we might be able to measure, though wouldn't be as easy, we could measure whether carbon dioxide was having the effect that we believe that it does. In this experiment, what would the variables be then? What would be the independent variable? What am I changing? Let's say that we're looking at the light intensity. What would be my dependent variable? What would I be measuring? And what would I need to control in this experiment to make sure that it was valid? Just give you a minute on your bit of paper to jot those down. What are the 3 variables for this experiment? Got those? Great. If you haven't, don't forget you can pause before I move on. Independent variable then. What is the independent variable? It is the light intensity. We were looking at changing the distance that the light is away from the plant, which would change the light intensity. If you've got distance down, that would be fine too. The dependent then is the rate of photosynthesis. So we are counting the number of bubbles per minute, and from that we're calculating the rate of photosynthesis. So either of those, the part in the brackets or the part outside of the brackets, would be fine as an answer to that. And then what would we control? We would need to control the temperature, because we know that temperature is a limiting factor. So we could use a heat shield, or we could use a thermometer to monitor it to ensure it doesn't change. We could also control the carbon dioxide levels, because carbon dioxide is a limiting factor. So we would put sodium hydrogen carbonate, which is just baking powder. That would make sure there was a plentiful supply of carbon dioxide the whole time we were carrying out the experiment. And then we would use the same piece of pondweed each time, because then we could make sure it was the same age and species and length, that would help control the chlorophyll, which we know is one of the other limiting factors. So whenever we carry out a photosynthesis experiment, we need to control the other limiting factors while we investigate the single limiting factor that we're interested in. There are some slight changes to this experiment. So instead of light intensity, you might look at the colour of light. Are you aware of why plants are green? If not, then this is why. So when light shines on a plant, red and orange and purple and blue would be absorbed by the plant. But green and yellow parts of the white light would be reflected back into your eye. That's why plants look green. It's the green light that's being reflected, the other colours are being absorbed. The chlorophyll, which is what is absorbing that light, it only absorbs the red and the blue ends of the spectrum. So we could use that idea of white light being made of different colours of light, different wavelengths of light, to investigate by just slightly adapting the experiment. So here we've got different coloured tubes which have the pondweed in them. So we can still shine white light on them, but they will only allow the coloured light that the tube is made from to be able to get to the plant. And we can then record how much photosynthesis that plant does in the same way, counting the number of bubbles. Which colour of all of those test tubes there do you think that photosynthesis will take place fastest in? Which colour will be the best for photosynthesis to take place? Just give you a couple of seconds to think about that and to make a decision. I don't know whether this graph will help you make your decision. So there are the different colours of light, different wavelengths of light on the bottom there, and you can see how much is being absorbed by the chlorophyll from that graph. It is actually blue light or red light which would be the best one for photosynthesis to take place. The greens and the yellows in the middle of that graph, you can see they're not being absorbed, therefore there would be no energy for the photosynthesis to take place. That's plants covered then. So now let's have a look at animals. Animals respire. They don't photosynthesize, they only respire. So what are they respiring for? They're respiring so that they can transfer energy. What is that energy being used for in that animal? Just give you half a minute. Can you think of any things that animals need energy for? Okay, some of the things that you might have on your list then. For movement, so that is conscious muscle contraction. When you choose to move, you choose to contract your muscles, and we need energy from respiration to do that. For unconscious muscle contraction too, so those muscles that are happening all the time, even without us thinking about it, like our heart is beating and we are breathing. For maintaining our body temperature, but that only applies to mammals and birds. Reptiles and amphibians and fish, they don't maintain their body temperature. So that wouldn't be an answer if the exam question was asking about one of those. And then chemical reactions. So they need to make things like proteins and fats and so on. These chemical reactions would be our metabolism. So your metabolism is all of the chemical reactions that are taking place in your cells. So the respiration that we've talked about, the conversion of glucose into starch and glycogen and cellulose, they are all examples of metabolism. Be careful with that one. Glycogen is the only one that takes place in animals, and cellulose and starch are the only ones that take place in plants. The breakdown of excess proteins to make urea for excretion, that is another example of metabolism, another example of chemical reactions taking place in cells. Production of amino acids and production of proteins, again, another example of metabolism. So metabolism is either the building up or breaking down as these chemical reactions take place. And you can see there's a list of lots of different things that proteins might be used for in your body. Enzymes, your muscle tissues, making antibodies and making hormones. And then we also will make lipids. So we need lipids for cell membranes, for energy stores, for protection, for waterproofing, and for insulation. So metabolism is the production of all of these different things that your body needs, the chemical reactions that take place to enable your body to make the things that it needs. Let's have a go at some of those questions then about metabolism and some examples of it. I'll give you a couple of minutes to have a go at those, so just jot them down and we'll go through the answers in a minute or two. Okay, if you need a little bit more time, just press pause before I move on. So metabolism is the sum of all of the chemical reactions in the cells of the body. One is the formation of lipids, give one other. Plenty of choice here, you could have had any one of these. Respiration, formation of proteins, photosynthesis, formation or breakdown of glycogen, and the breakdown of excess protein. You only needed one of them, so any one of those would have been allowed. What is meant by metabolic rate? Metabolic rate is the rate of chemical reactions in the body. Notice that the S is underlined on that answer. So what we're saying is that it's not just one chemical reaction, it is all of the chemical reactions taking place in the body. What might affect a person's metabolic rate? So again, there was 2 marks here, but there were 4 possible answers. So we could have talked about the genetics that the person had, or what they'd inherited, their proportion of muscle to fat, or their body mass, their age, or the rate at which they're growing, and their gender. So males and females have different metabolic rates. Then that final question is asking you to say which metabolic process produces water. You might not have had a clue about that, but it was a sneaky little question there to see if you can remember what is the respiration equation, because the correct answer was respiration of glucose, because you remember glucose plus oxygen makes carbon dioxide and water. The next thing we're going to look at then is exercise. So what happens to our body when we exercise? Few things you should be able to think about. So think about if you were to go for a run right now. If you haven't got a clue, in fact, you can pause this and you can jog up and down on the spot for a couple of minutes and see what happens. So just have a think about when you exercise, what happens to your body, what changes take place. Give you half a minute to jot down as many things as you can think of. If you need a little bit more time, just press pause now. Okay, so these are some of the things that you may have had on your list. You might have said that you breathe faster. As well as breathing more quickly, we also breathe more deeply. And your heart rate increases, and that heart rate is beating more blood per beat. You do get hotter or possibly go red when you exercise, but that isn't something that the exam board will want to hear about. That's a side effect of exercising. So when you respire more, you produce the effect of getting hotter because energy is wasted as thermal energy. That isn't something that helps us to exercise, and so we're only interested in those top 4 on that slide there if you're asked about exercise effects on the body in an exam question. Why do those changes happen then? Why do you breathe faster and more deeply, and why does your heart beat more often and with more blood pumped per beat? Why do those changes happen to your body? Half a minute, just see if you can write down why you think they are. If you need a little bit more time, just press pause and then you can give yourself the extra time that you need. Okay, hopefully you have this on your list. Hopefully you said that more oxygen is needed, and that's why all of these things happen. If you did that, that would only be one of the possible marks that are available. So everybody remember to say about oxygen, but there are other reasons too. So you also need to talk about all of these things. Why is that oxygen needed? So I've underlined it, it's really important. More oxygen is needed for more aerobic respiration. But what else does that extra breathing and blood flow do? The extra blood flow is bringing more glucose, because you can't carry out respiration with only oxygen. You need glucose too. And the extra breathing and quicker blood flow will also remove excess carbon dioxide from the cells more quickly, and will remove any lactic acid that has built up from the cells more quickly. So we need to think about not just oxygen, but also glucose, carbon dioxide, and potentially any lactic acid. So this is why all of these changes are happening when we exercise. Don't only talk about the obvious one. If you do get too much lactic acid building up because you haven't been able to get enough oxygen to your respiring cells, anaerobic respiration will take place, that lactic acid will build up, and we get what we call an oxygen debt. So the oxygen debt is that build up of the lactic acid. Your muscles will become fatigued and they'll then stop contracting efficiently. So that is what lactic acid will do to the cells. Let's have a look at a question then. So exercise cannot be sustained when anaerobic respiration takes place in muscle cells. Explain why. It's 2 marks, so we're looking for 2 different points. Just jot that down please with your bit of paper and pen. Pause me if you're not quite ready for the answer. Okay, so what's happening? Your muscles are becoming fatigued and they would stop contracting, and that's because not enough energy is being transferred. Remember we said that the anaerobic respiration, there was less energy that was able to be transferred. Here's another one, a long answer question this time, so we're looking for 4 marks, 4 separate points. How do changes in blood flow to an athlete's muscles help him to run? Let's write down, we're looking for 4 different points please. Okay, you've had 2 minutes. If you need a little bit more time, just press pause and then you can unpause me when you're ready to check your answer. What were the exam board looking for then? That mark that everybody always remembers, it supplies more oxygen. It also supplies more glucose for a second mark, And why is that good? So we can have more respiration. Even better if you've said aerobic respiration. And that releases more energy or transfers more energy. Remember, it doesn't make energy, but it can transfer or release more energy. They would also have allowed removes more carbon dioxide or removes more lactic acid or removes more heat if you hadn't got both the oxygen and glucose marks. But to get the 4 full marks, you need to talk about respiration and energy. Here is a more complicated exam question. They've given you a graph and they've given you some information to read, but it is looking very much at those same things we've just been looking at. So this time we're looking at heart rate, number of times the heart beats per minute, and also the volume of blood that travels out of the heart each time the heart beats. They've got 2 people and they've made them run as fast as they could for a minute, and they've measured their heart rates and stroke volumes before, during and after the exercise. They then give you a little bit of information about how cardiac output is calculated. So the idea that they're multiplying the heart rate by the stroke volume to give them the cardiac output. And then they've asked you to look at information from the graph to answer the 2 questions. So we've got a short 1 mark question and a longer 5 mark question that needs a little bit more of a longer response to it. So I'll give you some time to have a go at answering those. Okay, if you need a little bit more time, just press pause. Otherwise, I'm going to go on to the answers now. So, the first one, what is the main reason that person 2 had a lower cardiac output? It's to do with their lower stroke volume. So, person 2 is pumping out a smaller volume of blood each beat, and therefore that's why. That's having more of an effect than their heart rate. Why could person 1 run much faster than person 2? They send more blood to the muscles. That blood has got more oxygen in it and it's got more glucose in it. So that means that they can respire more, or so they can transfer more energy. So you can see it's those similar marks they're looking for every time. It's not just about the oxygen, it's also about the glucose, and the whole reason for it is so that they can respire to transfer more energy. So we are aware that humans will respire anaerobically if they don't have enough oxygen when they're exercising, and obviously that's really important because that keeps them alive and able to transfer energy even when oxygen isn't available. But it's also useful to us when other organisms respire anaerobically, and that's because we can use the products of that. So when yeast respires anaerobically, we can use that to make alcohol, such as beer and wine, and it helps bread rise. So when you leave the bread to rise, it is the yeast respiring that gives that carbon dioxide, and that's what forms the bubbles that give bread the texture that it needs. So, dead easy question then. Anaerobic respiration in yeast, called fermentation, which you will have learned about in chemistry. Give one use of fermentation in the food industry. Just a one-word answer. What are you going to go for? Okay, so hopefully you've either got brewing, and for that we'll accept making beer or making wine, or you've got bread making. Now, there are also some sneaky questions that can be asked about respiration and photosynthesis. You need to remember that plants respire as well as photosynthesize. So sometimes you'll see questions that ask you about both of those. So the key thing to remember, plants respire all the time, whether it's light or dark, but they only photosynthesize when it's light. So this graph is showing us the changes in carbon dioxide concentration throughout a 24-hour period that a plant has been recorded. So it's in a greenhouse full of tomato plants. They're recording the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the air. So we're looking at the bottom. It tells us about what time of the day it is. So from that you need to work out whether it's going to be light or dark. And then from that, why are concentrations of carbon dioxide changing? So it's asking you about the changes between X and Y, and then the changes between Y and Z. Just have a think about what's taking place there. Okay, so between X and Y, what we can see is that the carbon dioxide level is increasing, and that's because it's being produced during respiration. There's no photosynthesis because it's dark. But between Y and Z, when it's light, the plant is photosynthesizing as well as respiring. So that means that carbon dioxide is being used up. And actually more photosynthesis must be happening than respiration, which means that carbon dioxide levels are falling, because even though the plant is still producing some carbon dioxide, it's using more than it produces. Here is another question. So this isn't a required practical, but they can give you information about practicals and expect you to be able to interpret what's happening. So we've got 4 test tubes. There's an indicator solution in there, which is green under normal concentrations of carbon dioxide, yellow if carbon dioxide levels are high, and blue if carbon dioxide levels are low. It doesn't harm aquatic organisms. So in one of them we've got some pondweed, in another one we've got a water snail, and in the final tube we've got pondweed and a water snail. What we're being asked to do is to explain why the indicator has gone yellow in tube C, and predict what would happen to tube D if we'd have had it in the dark instead of in the light. And you would need to be able to explain why that was happening. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to see if you can jot down some answers to those questions. Okay, if you've not quite finished, just press pause before I go on to the answers. So why has the indicator solution in tube C turned yellow? It turns yellow when the concentration of CO2 is high, and it is high because the snail is respiring. So the water snail respires and releases carbon dioxide, and that's changed the colour. Tube D stays green, so it's got normal concentrations of carbon dioxide. So the plant is producing carbon dioxide and, the plant is using carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. The snail is producing carbon dioxide and using oxygen. If it had been in the dark, there would have been no photosynthesis, and so it would have turned yellow. The plant wouldn't photosynthesize, but the animal and plant would both keep respiring, so carbon dioxide would keep being produced. Another graph question again then, looking at carbon dioxide that is being taken up and released by a bean plant. It tells you it's a hot summer's day. And again, it's between midnight and midnight what's happening. So just see if you can have a look at those questions, jot down your answers, and we'll go through them in a couple of minutes. Okay, if you're not quite ready, press pause. I'm going to go through the answers now. Right then. At which two times in the day did the rate of photosynthesis exactly match the rate of respiration? That would be when there was no change in the mass of carbon dioxide. So we're looking for where it crosses the axes. So sometime between 7:15 and 7:45 would have been the point at which it crosses the axes. You then had to read off the graph how much carbon dioxide is released each hour during respiration. 11. So where did we get that from? We were looking for a point when there was no photosynthesis but there was respiration, and you can see that it is 11 units below the x-axis. How much carbon dioxide is used by photosynthesis in the hour beginning at 3 p.m. So what we did, we looked at how high up the reading went. So it went up to 22, and we added the 11 that the plant itself was releasing, that we'd worked out in part 1. So 33 units is where that came from. And then over the 24-hour period, the total amount of carbon dioxide taken in was greater than the amount given out. Why is that important for the bean plant? It's more photosynthesis taking place than respiration, which means that more biomass or more carbohydrate is being made, and that means the plant can grow, or it can possibly store food if that's what it needs to do. So now, hopefully you've got a good understanding of photosynthesis, respiration, metabolism and exercise, and you can have a go at other questions that your teacher will provide for you.